The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the wind pressing against the window pane. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee clasped tightly in her hands. The night before had been restless, filled with vivid dreams and fleeting whispers that she couldn't quite grasp. Her heart felt heavy, yet strangely light at the same time, like something immense was shifting within her. She glanced at her phone. An unfamiliar video had appeared in her feed. Its title read, "You Are Chosen. A Message for You." Her finger hovered over the screen before pressing play. The voice from the video spoke with conviction, each word carrying a weight that seemed to settle deep in her chest. "This isn't a coincidence," the voice said. "You didn't stumble here by accident. You were led. God is calling you." Sarah's breath hitched. Tears pooled in her eyes as the words resonated deep in her soul. She had spent years praying, hoping, and waiting for a sign, for something to remind her that her struggles, her pain, weren't in vain. And here it was, in the form of a voice on a screen. In every life, there comes a moment when the veil between the ordinary and the extraordinary grows thin, a moment when clarity pierces through the fog of doubt. For Sarah, this was that moment. The voice spoke of shifting from wanting to having, from hoping to receiving. It wasn't just a mindset shift. It was something spiritual, something divine. She closed her eyes and whispered, "God, is this really for me? Have you truly chosen me for something greater?" Her heart thundered in her chest, but somewhere beneath the rush of emotions, a quiet peace began to bloom. It was as if God Himself had leaned down, placed a hand on her shoulder, and whispered, "Yes, child. This is for you." The sun was rising now, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. Sarah felt a determination she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the kind of resolve that came from fleeting motivation. It was something unshakable, rooted deep in her spirit. She grabbed her journal, the one she hadn't touched in months, and began to write. Today, something changed. I don't fully understand it yet, but I feel it. I'm no longer asking if I'm enough. I'm no longer waiting for someone to validate my purpose. I know now, I am chosen, and whatever comes next, I'll be ready. Sarah's phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her best friend, Claire. "Morning, Sarah. You've been on my mind all night. Is everything okay?" Sarah hesitated before typing back. How could she put into words the transformation she had just experienced? Instead, she replied simply, "Something's changing, Claire. I can't explain it, but I know it's good." Claire's response came almost immediately. "Whatever it is, I'm here for you. Always." The day moved forward, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something monumental. Every interaction, every conversation, every fleeting glance at the sky felt charged with meaning. It was as if she had been walking through life half asleep, and now, finally, she was awake. Later that evening, Sarah found herself sitting in the quiet stillness of her bedroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes, though tired, carried a spark she hadn't seen in years. She leaned closer and spoke softly to herself. "You are not ordinary. You are chosen, and it's time to start living like it." The words hung in the air, thick with power and truth. Sarah felt them settle into her bones, into the very fabric of who she was. She wasn't just hearing these words, she was becoming them. That night, as she lay in bed, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the future. She wasn't consumed by the weight of unanswered questions or the fear of not being enough. She knew, deep down in her soul, that she was being led, and wherever God was taking her, she was ready to follow. Outside her window, the stars shimmered with quiet brilliance, as if they, too, knew the sacred truth that was beginning to unfold. "This is just the beginning," Sarah whispered into the darkness. and I am ready. The soft golden light of early morning filtered through Sarah's curtains as she sat cross-legged on her bed, her journal open in front of her. The words she had written the night before still glimmered in her mind. I am chosen, and whatever comes next, I'll be ready. But what did that truly mean? Chosen for what? Ready for what? Her phone buzzed. A message from Claire lit up the screen. Hey, are you free for breakfast? I feel like we need to talk. Sarah hesitated before typing back. Sure, see you at Joe's Diner in 30. Joe's Diner was a small, cozy spot on Main Street where time seemed to slow down. The bell above the door jingled as Sarah stepped inside, the scent of fresh coffee and pancakes wrapping around her like a warm hug. Claire was already there, her bright blue eyes scanning the room until they landed on Sarah. Hey, you, Claire said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You look different, lighter, somehow. Sarah slid into the booth across from her and let out a soft laugh. I feel different, but I don't know how to explain it. It's like something inside me woke up. Claire's expression shifted, her brows knitting together. Woke up? Sarah, are you okay? Sarah sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug. I don't expect you to understand, Claire. But last night I felt something, like a whisper in my soul, a message that I'm chosen for something bigger. And I know it sounds crazy, but I can't shake the feeling. For a moment, Claire was silent. The clinking of dishes and the hum of conversations filled the space between them. Finally, Claire leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. It doesn't sound crazy. Sometimes we're given moments of clarity, little nudges from God or the universe or whatever you want to call it. And maybe this is yours. Sarah felt her chest tighten, emotion swelling in her throat. But what am I supposed to do, Claire? What does being chosen even mean? Claire reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. Maybe it's not about knowing the whole path right now. Maybe it's about taking the first step in faith. The day moved forward, but Sarah's mind remained anchored in that conversation. Her thoughts swirled like leaves caught in a strong wind. Take the first step. But what was the first step? That afternoon, Sarah found herself wandering through the park. Children laughed in the distance, birds sang their familiar songs, and yet everything felt surreal, like she was seeing the world through a new lens. She sat on an old wooden bench, her fingers interlaced in her lap, and whispered a prayer into the open sky. God, if you've truly chosen me for something, show me the way. Help me see the first step. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves around her feet. And in that quiet moment, Sarah felt something, a flicker of peace, a subtle sense of direction. Her eyes fell on an elderly man sitting on a nearby bench, his shoulders hunched and his eyes fixed on the ground. Without fully understanding why, Sarah stood up and walked over. Hi there, she said softly, offering a kind smile. Would you like some company? The man looked up, his eyes clouded with sadness but brightened slightly at her presence. Well, I suppose some company wouldn't hurt. They sat together, and he began to talk about his late wife, his regrets, and the loneliness that had become his shadow. Sarah listened, truly listened, and somewhere in his words, she felt a deeper truth unfolding. Her presence, her willingness to simply be there, was making a difference. When they finally parted ways, the man's face had softened, and he held her hand tightly as he said, Thank you, young lady. You have no idea how much this meant to me today. Sarah walked home with a sense of clarity settling in her chest. Maybe being chosen wasn't about grand gestures or monumental achievements. Maybe it was about showing up, being present, being kind, and letting God work through her in the small, everyday moments. That night, Sarah wrote in her journal again. I think I'm starting to understand. Being chosen isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to step out in faith, even when the path ahead isn't clear. Today, I felt it. I felt purpose, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. She closed the journal and let out a deep breath. The question of what comes next still lingered, but for the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt hopeful. The stars outside her window twinkled softly, as if nodding in agreement. Somewhere deep in her heart, Sarah knew. This was just the beginning. The early morning sun streamed through Sarah's window, casting golden streaks across her room. The journal lay open on her nightstand, its pages filled with raw emotions, questions, and small glimpses of clarity. Today felt different, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make her next move. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, clutching a mug of tea, staring at the wall in deep thought. The encounter with the elderly man in the park lingered in her mind. It had moment, yet it carried so much weight. Was this what being chosen felt like? Small moments turning into monumental shifts? A faint knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. "Morning, kiddo," her father said, peeking into her room. His graying hair and weary smile told stories Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to hear. "You've been quiet lately. Everything all right?" Sarah hesitated. Her father was a man of few words, not one to dwell on matters of the heart. But something told her this moment was important. "Dad, do you ever feel like you were made for something more? Like there's something inside you, something powerful, but you don't know how to reach it?" Her father's face softened as he stepped inside, lowering himself into the armchair across from her. "You know, Sarah, I used to think that way when I was younger. But life has a way of piling bricks on your shoulders until you forget you were ever light enough to fly." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "But you've always had a spark in you. Don't let the weight of the world smother it." His words hit Sarah like a gentle wave, soaking into her soul. Her father, a man who rarely opened up, had just handed her a truth she hadn't realized she needed. Later that afternoon, Sarah decided to go for a hike. There was an old trail just outside of town that she hadn't visited in years. She packed a bottle of water, slipped on her hiking boots, and headed out. The forest was alive with sound, birds chirping overhead, leaves rustling underfoot, and the distant murmur of a stream. But beneath all that noise was a stillness, a sacred quiet that seemed to envelop her as she walked. Halfway up the trail, Sarah paused to catch her breath. The incline had been steeper than she remembered, and her legs burned with every step. She glanced up at the peak in the distance, so far away it seemed almost unreachable. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, "one step at a time." And so she climbed, step by step, breath by breath. Her body ached, her lungs begged for air, but something inside her wouldn't let her stop. It wasn't just stubbornness. It was something deeper. A spark. A fire. A knowing that she was capable of more than she had ever given herself credit for. Finally, she reached the top. The view stretched out before her, a tapestry of greens and blues and golden sunlight spilling over the horizon. She dropped to her knees, tears filling her eyes as she whispered into the wind, "Thank you, God. Thank you for showing me. Me." The strength she had felt climbing that mountain wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, emotional, divine. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt unbreakable, not because she was free of fear or doubt, but because she now understood that those things didn't define her strength. Her strength came from her willingness to keep going, even when everything inside her screamed to stop. That evening, Sarah sat on her porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The stars glittered above, tiny beacons of light scattered across an endless canvas. Her phone buzzed beside her. It was Claire. "Hey, Sarah, I don't know why, but I felt like I needed to tell you something tonight. You're stronger than you think. Whatever you're searching for, I know you'll find it." Sarah smiled, her chest tight with gratitude. She picked up her journal and began to write. "Today, I climbed a mountain. not just a physical one, but an emotional one, too. I realized that strength isn't about having all the answers or never feeling afraid. It's about taking one more step when every part of you wants to turn back. It's about believing that God's hand is steadying you, even when you can't feel it. I think I'm starting to understand who I am. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a sense of clarity. The world hadn't changed, but she had. The doubts still whispered, the fears still lingered, but they no longer controlled her. As she stood by her window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of pink and gold, Sarah made a promise to herself. No matter how steep the climb, no matter how loud the doubts, I will keep going, because I am chosen, and I am strong. The rain tapped gently against Sarah's window, creating a rhythm that matched the restless beat of her heart. Outside, the sky was painted in shades of gray, heavy with unspoken words and unwept tears. Sarah sat curled up on her couch, her knees tucked under her chin, a steaming mug of tea cradled in her hands. Her father's words from days ago echoed in her mind. Don't let the weight of the world smother your spark. But what if the weight wasn't just the world? What if it was the people around her, the ones who had, knowingly or unknowingly, wrapped invisible chains around her spirit? The familiar chime of an incoming message pulled her attention back to her phone. It was from her old boss, Mark. Sarah, I need you to handle something for me. I know you're technically not working for us anymore, but I need your help. You've always been the only one I could count on. Her chest tightened. Mark had a way with words, a way of framing his needs as Sarah's responsibilities. It wasn't the first time he'd reached out since she'd left the job, a job that had drained her, consumed her, and left her feeling like a shell of herself. She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Should I just help him one more time? It's harmless, right? But deep down, she knew the truth. Every one more time was another chain. Every small favor was another brick in a wall she had worked so hard to tear down. That afternoon, Sarah met Claire at their usual spot, a corner booth at Joe's Diner. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm pancakes filled the air as the two friends sat in silence for a moment. You look like you've been carrying something heavy, Claire said gently, her eyes searching Sarah's face. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. It's Mark again. He's asking for help, and I know I should say no, but I don't want to disappoint him. I don't want to be seen as selfish. Claire set her mug down with a soft clink. Sarah, listen to me. You're not being selfish by saying no. You've given so much of yourself to people who wouldn't hesitate to drain you dry. That's not loyalty, that's self-sacrifice, and not the good kind. Sarah's eyes welled up. The truth in Claire's words stung, but it was a necessary sting, like antiseptic on an open wound. Claire continued, her voice softer now. You have to stop letting people hold power over you through guilt. You're allowed to protect yourself. You're allowed to say no. That evening, Sarah sat at her desk, staring at Mark's message again. Her fingers trembled as she typed her response. Mark, I've always valued our professional relationship, but I can't keep stepping back into something I've left behind. I hope you understand, but I need to honor the boundaries I've set for myself. I wish you all the best. She hesitated for a moment before pressing send. When the message disappeared, a wave of relief washed over her, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. She realized then that breaking free wasn't about dramatic exits or grand gestures. Sometimes it was as simple and as brave as saying, no more. In the following days, Sarah began to notice patterns she had ignored for years. There were other people in her life, friends, family members, colleagues, who had quietly built invisible chains around her spirit. Some used guilt, others used flattery. A few disguised their control as concern. But now, Sarah could see the patterns clearly, and one by one she began to break the chains. She said no to commitments that drained her energy, She stepped back from relationships that were built on one-sided giving. She stopped apologizing for protecting her peace. It wasn't easy. Each conversation felt like walking a tightrope, her heart pounding with fear of how people might react. But with every boundary she set, with every chain she broke, Selah felt something powerful rise within her, a strength she had only begun to understand. One evening, Sarah's father found her sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring up at the stars. "You've been different lately," he said as he lowered himself into the chair beside her. Selah smiled faintly. "Good different, or good different," he said with a nod. "You look free, like a weight's been lifted off your shoulders." She turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I didn't realize how much I had given away, Dad. My time, my energy, my peace, all because I was afraid of letting people down. But I can't live like that anymore." Her father reached over and squeezed her hand. "It takes a lot of courage to break free from things, and people, that keep you tethered. I'm proud of you, kiddo." That night, Selah wrote in her journal, "Breaking free isn't just about walking away from toxic situations. It's about reclaiming your voice, your choices, and your peace. Today, I chose me. And for the first time in a long time, I feel free." She closed the journal and set it aside, her heart light and her mind clear. The chains that once held her down were gone, and the path ahead was open, waiting for her to step boldly into whatever came next. Outside her window, the night sky stretched endlessly above her, a reminder that freedom wasn't just a feeling. It was a state of being, and she was finally living in it. The sun was setting in a wash of amber and lavender as Selah parked her car near the park trail she had grown so fond of. A soft breeze carried the scent of fresh pine and earth, filling her lungs with every deep breath. But tonight, the forest felt different, quieter, heavier somehow, as if it held a secret it was waiting for her to uncover. Selah grabbed her backpack and walked toward her favorite bench near the lake. The surface of the water was still, reflecting the hues of the twilight sky like a perfect mirror. She closed her eyes and whispered, "God, help me protect what you've given me." Over the past few weeks, Selah had been learning how fragile her inner peace could be, how easily her energy could be drained by people, situations, or even her own racing thoughts. She had always been a giver, someone who poured herself out for others without stopping to refill her own cup. But now, she was beginning to understand that her energy wasn't limitless. It was sacred, and it needed protecting. The following day, Selah sat at her desk, surrounded by sticky notes and unopened emails. Her phone buzzed, a friend from high school asking if Selah could talk real quick about a problem she was having. Selah hesitated. The old version of her would have dropped everything, picked up the phone and spent hours listening, absorbing the stress and negativity like a sponge. But today, something stopped her. A quiet voice in her heart whispered, "It's okay to say no. Your energy is sacred." Instead of picking up the phone, Selah replied, "Hey, I care about you, but I can't talk right now. I'm taking some time to recharge. Let's set a time to talk when I can be fully present for you." She hit send and leaned back in her chair. Her heart raced. Saying no still felt foreign, almost wrong. But instead of guilt, she felt something else, a sense of calm, a stillness that told her she had done the right thing. That weekend, Selah joined Claire for coffee. They sat by the window at Joe's diner, their mugs steaming in front of them as rain drizzled against the glass. "Boundaries are hard, aren't they?" Claire said, her voice gentle. Selah nodded. "So hard. But they're also freeing. I've started to realize that every time I say yes to something that drains me, I'm saying no to something that fills me." Claire smiled, her eyes lighting up. "That's it, Selah. You're learning to honor your energy. And let me tell you, that's not selfish. It's holy." The word holy stuck with Selah as she walked back to her car. Protecting her energy wasn't just about self-care, It was about respecting the gift God had placed within her. Her time, her peace, her focus, they were all tools God had given her to fulfill her purpose, and if she let them be scattered and drained by every demand, she'd have nothing left for what truly mattered. The next morning, Sarah woke up to a text from her cousin, Jessica. Jessica was known for her dramatic outbursts and constant crises, ones that Sarah had often been pulled into without hesitation. "Hey, Sarah, I need you to come over." "It's urgent." Sarah stared at the message. Her instinct was to grab her keys and drive over immediately. But then, she paused. Urgent had been Jessica's favorite word for years, but rarely was it actually true. Sarah replied, "Hey, Jess, I'm here for you, but I can't come over right now." "Is everything okay? Can we talk on the phone instead?" A minute passed, then 2. Then Jessica replied, "Never mind. It's not that big of a deal. I'll figure it out." Sarah set her phone down and exhaled slowly. Boundaries weren't walls. They were doors, and not everyone needed a key to walk through them. That afternoon, Sarah sat by her window journaling. "God, thank you for teaching me that my energy is sacred. Thank you for showing me that saying no to things that drain me is actually saying yes to you. Help me keep protecting this light you've placed inside me, so I can shine it where it's truly needed." She closed the journal and looked out at the world beyond her window. Birds flitted between branches, leaves swayed in the wind, and the sky stretched endlessly above her. Peace settled over her heart, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt in control, not of the world, not of other people, but of herself. A week later, Sarah found herself in a volunteer meeting at her local community center. The room was buzzing with chatter and activity as people sorted donations and prepared food baskets for families in need. As Sarah worked alongside the others, she felt something incredible. Her energy wasn't being drained. It was being multiplied. When she poured her time and focus into something aligned with her purpose, it didn't exhaust her. It filled her. And in that realization, Sarah found clarity. Protecting her energy wasn't about hoarding it. It was about stewarding it, using it where it mattered most. That evening, Sarah stood on her porch as the sky faded into twilight. She thought about all the times she had given her energy away out of guilt, fear, or obligation. But now, she was different. She was learning to say no, to protect her peace, her light, her sacred connection to God. In the distance, the first stars began to shimmer, tiny sparks in the darkening sky. Sarah smiled and whispered into the quiet night, "My energy is sacred. My time is sacred. My purpose is sacred. And from now on, I will treat them that way." The wind carried her words away like a prayer rising into the heavens. The day was warm, and sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of the small community church where Sarah had started volunteering. Rows of food baskets lined the wooden tables, and the faint hum of quiet conversations filled the space. Sarah tied her apron around her waist and glanced around the room. Everywhere she looked, she saw faces. Some tired, some hopeful, some carrying burdens so heavy they seemed to stoop under their weight. "Sarah, could you help me with this box?" asked Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman with kind eyes and hands that had seen decades of hard work. "Of course," Sarah replied, her voice soft but steady. As she carried the heavy box of canned goods across the room, she noticed a young boy sitting alone near the back. His head was down, his knees pulled up to his chest. Something in Sarah's heart stirred, a familiar whisper, a gentle nudge. She set the box down and walked over to him. "Hey there," she said softly, lowering herself to his eye level. "I'm Sarah. What's your name?" The boy looked up slowly. His eyes were wide and filled with something Sarah couldn't quite name. Fear, sadness, maybe both. "Evan," he mumbled. "Hi, Evan. Are you here with someone?" He shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "My mom. She said she'd be right back, but she's been gone a long time." Sarah's chest tightened. She glanced around the room but didn't see anyone who seemed to be looking for Evan. Gently, she sat down beside him. "Well, while we wait for your mom, would you like to help me with something? I could really use a partner to hand out these sandwiches. You'd be perfect for the job." For a moment, Evan hesitated, but then he nodded slowly. Sarah reached out her hand, and he took it. A small, fragile connection that felt monumental. Hours passed, and Evan stayed by Sarah's side. He handed out sandwiches with a shy smile, his small hands gripping each paper bag carefully. Every time someone said thank you, Sarah noticed a flicker of pride in his eyes. It was a quiet transformation, but one that felt deeply sacred. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the tables were nearly empty, a woman burst through the church doors. Her face was streaked with tears, her hair disheveled. "Evan!" she cried, her voice breaking with relief. The boy turned, his face lighting up as he ran into his mother's arms. The two of them clung to each other, their tears mingling as they whispered apologies and reassurances. Sarah stood back, her own eyes brimming with tears. Mrs. Jenkins appeared beside her, her voice low and steady. "It's moments like this, dear, that remind us why we do what we do. Sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness to hold someone together just long enough." Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Compassion wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about showing up in the small, quiet moments when someone else's world felt like it was falling apart. That night, Sarah sat on her porch swing, her journal balanced on her lap. The wind was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Her heart felt full, but it also felt heavy. She had always thought compassion was something soft. Gentle words, warm smiles. But today she realized it was also something strong. It took courage to sit with someone in their pain, to offer them a hand when they felt like they were drowning. "God, thank you for showing me the power of compassion today. Thank you for Evan, for his mother, and for every person who crossed my path. Help me remember that even the smallest act of kindness can carry the weight of eternity." She closed her journal and let her head fall back against the swing, her eyes gazing up at the vast sky. In her chest, she felt it again, that quiet, steady peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The following week, Sarah found herself at Joe's diner with Claire again. The two women sat at their favorite booth, their mugs of coffee untouched as they spoke softly. "You know, Claire," Sarah began, her voice thick with emotion, "I always thought compassion was about giving, about pouring myself out for others. But I think I've realized something." Claire leaned forward slightly, listening intently. "Compassion isn't just about what you give. It's about how you give it. It's about being fully present, fully aware, and fully willing to let someone else's pain touch you without letting it consume you." Claire's eyes shimmered with tears as she nodded. "That's beautiful, Sarah. And it's true. Compassion isn't weakness. It's one of the strongest forces in the world. And you, my friend, are living proof of that." A few days later, Sarah received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was small and careful, and when she opened it, a small drawing fell out, a crayon sketch of two stick figures holding sandwiches. The note read, "Dear Sarah, thank you for being my friend. I wasn't so scared when you were there. Love, Evan." Sarah pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes squeezed shut as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. In that moment, she understood. Compassion wasn't just something she gave away. It was something she carried with her, something that connected her to others in ways that went beyond words. That night, Sarah wrote in her journal, "Compassion isn't about fixing someone's life. It's about sitting with them in their moment of need and letting them know they aren't alone. It's about showing up, listening, and loving without expectation. Today, Evan taught me that even the smallest light can guide someone home." She placed the letter from Evan carefully between the pages of her journal, a keepsake of a moment that had quietly, but profoundly, changed her. As she turned off her bedside lamp and let the darkness settle around her, Sarah whispered a final prayer. God, let me always have the courage to love deeply, to listen fully, and to give freely. Amen. The morning air carried the scent of rain-soaked earth as Sarah walked along the familiar trail that led to her favorite spot by the lake. Autumn leaves crunched underfoot, their vibrant oranges and yellows scattered across the path like nature's confetti. A gray sky stretched endlessly above her, heavy with the promise of more rain. But Sarah didn't mind. Today, the world felt still, suspended in a moment of quiet anticipation. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the serenity. It was a message from Mark, her old boss, the same man who had once been a constant source of pressure and manipulation in her life. Sarah, I need to talk to you. Please, it's important. She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the reply button. Her stomach tightened, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something closer to resolve. She had learned to recognize manipulation, to see it for what it was, and most importantly, to refuse to let it control her anymore. With a deep breath, she typed, Mark, I hope you're doing well, but I can't help you with this. I'm focused on my own path now. I wish you the best. She hit send and felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't anger that filled her, it was peace. Mark no longer had power over her, and Sarah knew it wasn't because he had changed, but because she had. That afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Claire. Hey, Sarah, Claire said, her voice trembling slightly. Do you have a minute? I need to talk. Of course, Claire. What's wrong? There was silence on the line for a moment before Claire spoke again. It's my mom. She's in the hospital. They're saying it's serious. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Oh, Claire, I'm so sorry. I'll be there. Right now. Sarah grabbed her coat and keys and drove through the rain-slicked streets to the hospital. When she arrived, she found Claire sitting in the corner of the waiting room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her usually bright eyes were red and swollen, and her face was pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sarah sat down beside her and gently took her hand. I'm here. You don't have to go through this alone. Claire let out a shaky breath, leaning her head against Sarah's shoulder. I'm so scared, Sarah. What if I lose her? Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she whispered, I don't know what's going to happen, but I know you're strong. And I know God is here, even in this waiting room, even in this fear. The two friends sat in silence, their hands intertwined as they leaned into the uncertainty together. Hours later, after a long and grueling wait, a doctor approached with a tired smile. Claire, your mother is stable for now. She's asking for you. Relief flooded Claire's face as she let out a soft sob. She turned to Sarah, her voice breaking. Thank you. For being here. Sarah nodded, her own tears slipping down her cheeks. Always, Claire. Always. As Claire followed the doctor down the hallway, Sarah remained in the waiting room. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Thank you, God, for holding us steady in the storm. The next morning, Sarah found herself back on her porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands as she watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Her phone buzzed. It was another text, but this time it wasn't from someone asking for something. It was from Claire. She's awake, Sarah. She's talking and smiling. Thank you for being there last night. I don't know what I would have done without you. Sarah set the phone down and let out a long, shaky breath. She realized something in that moment. Something profound. All the lessons she had been learning over the past few months, the boundaries, the compassion, the strength, they had all been leading her to this point, to this moment of clarity. It wasn't just about breaking free from control or protecting her energy. It was about being ready to show up, to stand strong, and to be a light in someone else's darkest hour. Later that day, Sarah received an invitation from Mrs. Jenkins to speak at the community center's volunteer appreciation dinner. At first, Sarah hesitated. Speak? In front of people? The thought made her stomach churn. But then she remembered the countless moments when someone's words had lifted her, guided her, and given her hope. So she said yes. The evening of the dinner arrived, and Sarah stood at the podium, her palms damp and her heart racing. The room was filled with familiar faces, volunteers, friends, and even strangers who had become part of her journey. She took a deep breath and began to speak. I used to think strength was about having all the answers, about being fearless and unshakable. But over the past few months, I've learned that true strength is about showing up, even when you're afraid. It's about saying no to the things that drain you and yes to the things that align with your purpose. It's about compassion, not just for others, but for yourself. And sometimes strength is just sitting with someone in their pain and reminding them they're not alone. The room was silent, every eye fixed on Sarah. She could see tears glistening in a few faces, heads nodding slowly in agreement. We're all carrying something. We're all climbing mountains no one else can see. But I believe, with every fiber of my being, that God equips us for each step. He doesn't promise the path will be easy, but He does promise we won't have to walk it alone. As Sarah stepped away from the podium, the audience erupted into applause. But it wasn't the applause that filled her with peace. It was the knowledge that she had spoken her truth. And somewhere in that room, someone had needed to hear it. That night, as Sarah wrote in her journal, she realized something. This was the turning point. The moment where everything that had come before clicked into place. Every tear, every doubt, every small act of faith, it had all led her here. God, thank you for every step, every lesson, and every moment that brought me to this place. I don't know what comes next, but I'm ready. I trust you. As the ink dried on the page, Sarah felt it. A peace that surpassed understanding, a steady warmth that wrapped around her like a promise. The path ahead was still uncertain, but Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. The morning sun spilled across Sarah's kitchen table, bathing her journal in a golden glow. Her coffee steamed gently, curling upward in delicate swirls. The weight of recent events still clung to her shoulders, but there was something else now. A lightness, a steadiness she couldn't quite put into words. She traced her finger over the last line in her journal from the night before. I trust you, God. I'm ready. But what came next? The question hung heavy in her mind as she closed the journal and glanced at the small stack of letters beside her. They were invitations, speaking engagements, volunteer opportunities, and heartfelt notes from people who had heard her speak at the community center. Each letter carried a story, a connection, and a request. Come, share your light with us. Sarah felt a flicker of fear in her chest. Who was she to step into these spaces, to share her journey with strangers? But almost immediately, another thought followed. Who am I not to? That afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting in the front pew of the small church where she often volunteered. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting colorful patterns on the worn wooden floor. Beside her sat Pastor Allen, a kind older man with gentle eyes and a voice that carried wisdom in every syllable. You look like someone standing on the edge of a diving board, Sarah, he said with a warm smile. Sarah laughed softly, her fingers twisting together in her lap. That's exactly how I feel. I know there's something ahead of me, something big, but I can't shake this fear. What if I mess it up? What if I'm not enough? Pastor Allen leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Sarah, God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. Every step you've taken, every lesson you've learned has been preparing you for this moment. The question isn't whether you're ready. The question is whether you'll trust Him enough to take the next step. The words settled in her heart like stones dropped into still water, rippling outward with quiet strength. A week later, Sarah stood in the back of a large auditorium. Rows of chairs stretched out before her, filled with people, strangers who had come to hear her story. The hum of conversations buzzed in her ears, and her palms felt clammy as she clutched her notes. Why am I here? Who am I to speak to these people? But then a familiar voice whispered in her spirit, "You are chosen. You are ready." Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, blinding her momentarily, but as she adjusted to the spotlight, she began to see faces, eager, expectant, and open. She took a deep breath and began. She took a deep breath and began. I spent so much of my life waiting for permission, waiting for validation, waiting for someone else to tell me I was enough. But one day, I realized something. God had already equipped me with everything I needed. I was just too afraid to believe it.
The room was silent, hanging on her every word. Fear is loud, but faith whispers. And it was in those quiet moments, in the waiting rooms, the park benches, and the conversations with strangers, that I began to hear God's whisper. And that whisper told me, "You are chosen." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle over the audience. I don't know what brought each of you here today, but I know this. You're not here by accident. There's something inside you, something divine, something powerful, and it's waiting for you to recognize it, to embrace it, to step into it. When Sarah stepped off the stage, the applause was deafening. But it wasn't the applause that mattered to her. It was the faces, the tear-filled eyes, the nodding heads, the people who approached her afterward to say, "Thank you. I needed to hear that." Over the following months, Sarah traveled to different communities, speaking at schools, churches, and small gatherings. She listened to countless stories of heartbreak, resilience, and quiet miracles. Each story left an imprint on her heart, a reminder that this journey wasn't just about her, it was about all of them. One evening, after a particularly emotional event, Sarah sat in a quiet corner of her hotel room, staring out at the city lights below. Her phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Proud of you, Sarah. You're walking in your purpose, and it's so beautiful to see." Tears pooled in Sarah's eyes as she whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, God. Thank you for every step, every lesson, and every moment that brought me here." But the journey wasn't without challenges. There were days when Sarah felt drained, days when the weight of other people's stories threatened to crush her. There were moments of doubt, moments when she wondered if she was really making a difference. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Sarah found herself sitting alone in a small chapel. The candles flickered softly, casting warm shadows on the walls. "God," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm tired. I don't know if I can keep going." The silence that followed felt heavy, but then, in the stillness, came a familiar whisper. "You're not carrying this alone." Sarah closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. She realized then that the strength she needed didn't have to come from her, it came from God, and as long as she stayed connected to Him, she would always have enough. The next day, Sarah stepped back onto a stage. The crowd was smaller this time, but it didn't matter. She spoke with the same conviction, the same honesty, and the same vulnerability. At the end of the event, a teenage girl approached her, tears streaming down her face. "Miss Sarah, your words, they saved me. I've been carrying so much, and today I felt like I could finally breathe." Sarah hugged the girl tightly, her voice soft as she said, "You're stronger than you know, and you're not alone." That night, as Sarah wrote in her journal, she realized something profound. The journey wasn't about reaching a destination. It was about walking faithfully, one step at a time, no matter how steep the path or how heavy the load. "God, thank you for reminding me that my strength comes from you. Help me to keep walking, to keep showing up, and to keep trusting that you are guiding every step." She closed her journal, her heart full and her spirit steady. The journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. And for the first time in her life, Sarah wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She was ready. The golden hues of the late afternoon sun spilled across the community center's main hall,
as Sarah arranged chairs in neat rows. The faint hum of conversation drifted from the hallway, where volunteers sorted supplies for the evening outreach event. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, yet a calm sense of purpose anchored Sarah to the moment. In the months since she had embraced her calling, Sarah had spoken in countless rooms, walked alongside countless souls, and shared her story in places she never thought she'd stand. But here, in the familiar walls of the community center where her journey truly began, she felt a deep sense of belonging. As she set down the last chair, Mrs. Jenkins appeared at the doorway, her frail frame leaning on her wooden cane. "Busy as ever, aren't you, dear?" she said with a smile. Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans and grinned. "You know me, Mrs. Jenkins. Can't sit still for too long." Mrs. Jenkins' eyes twinkled. "There's something special about this place, isn't there? And something special about you, Sarah. You've become a light for so many people. Don't ever forget that." Sarah felt her throat tighten as she nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. That means more than you know." That evening, the hall was packed. Families, volunteers, and community members filled the chairs as Sarah stepped up to the small podium at the front of the room. Her heart pounded in her chest, not with fear, but with purpose.
"Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "When I first walked into this building months ago, I was lost. I was carrying more weight than I knew how to handle, and I didn't have a clear sense of where I was headed. But through moments of kindness, quiet whispers from God, and small acts of faith, I found clarity, I found purpose, and most importantly, I found the courage to serve." She paused, scanning the room. Faces of every age and background stared back at her, some smiling, some with tears in their eyes. Service isn't always about grand gestures or massive sacrifices. Sometimes it's as simple as sitting with someone in their pain. Sometimes it's handing out a sandwich to someone who's hungry. And sometimes it's just showing up and saying, "I'm here, you're not alone." The room was silent as her words hung in the air. A young woman in the front row wiped her eyes, and Sarah felt the sacred weight of the moment settle deep in her chest. After the event, people lingered in small clusters, sharing laughter and quiet conversations. Sarah spotted a familiar face in the corner, Evan, the young boy she had met months ago, sitting beside his mother. He waved shyly, and Sarah walked over. "Hi, Evan," she said warmly. "It's good to see you again." Evan's mother stood up, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Miss Sarah, I don't know if I ever properly thanked you. That day at the church, you saved us. You gave us a moment of hope when we had none." Sarah shook her head gently. "You don't need to thank me. God put us in each other's path for a reason." Evan tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Miss Sarah, I'm not scared anymore, and my mom isn't sad as much now. Thank you for being our friend." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she knelt down to his level and hugged him tightly. "You're so brave, Evan, and you're going to grow up to do incredible things. Never forget that." In the weeks that followed, Sarah's mission began to take on new shapes. She partnered with local organizations, created mentorship programs for young people, and continued sharing her story wherever she was invited. But it wasn't about recognition or applause. It was about impact. One quiet morning, Sarah sat in her living room with Claire. The two friends sipped coffee as sunlight filtered through the curtains. "You know," Claire said, breaking the silence, "it's incredible to see how far you've come. I remember our conversation at Joe's Diner, when you were still so unsure of yourself. And now, look at you." Sarah smiled softly. "I still have moments of doubt, Claire, but I've learned something important. Purpose isn't about having all the answers. It's about showing up every day, even when it's hard, and trusting that God is guiding each step." Claire nodded thoughtfully. "You're living your mission, Sarah, and it's beautiful to see." One Sunday afternoon, Sarah visited her father. They sat on the back porch, the sound of birds filling the spaces between their words. "You know, Dad," Sarah said quietly, "for so long, I thought being chosen meant being perfect, that I had to have it all figured out. But now, I realize it's not about being perfect. It's about being willing. Her father looked at her, his weathered face softened by a smile. That's wisdom, kiddo, and it's true. God doesn't ask for perfection. He asks for obedience, and you've shown up for that every step of the way. Selah felt a lump in her throat as she reached over and squeezed his hand. For so long she had carried doubts, fears, and insecurities, but sitting there under the warm glow of the afternoon sun, she felt nothing but gratitude. That night, Selah wrote in her journal, "Service isn't about being seen, it's about being faithful. Every small act, every quiet moment of kindness matters." Today, I saw God in Evan's smile, in Claire's encouragement, and in my father's wisdom. This journey isn't about me, it's about the people God places in my path and the love I'm called to pour into them. She closed the journal and set it aside. Outside her window, the stars began to appear, one by one, dotting the sky with light. Selah leaned back in her chair, a deep peace settling over her soul. She realized then that service wasn't a duty, it was a privilege. It was the very heartbeat of her calling. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Sarah's kitchen floor as she poured herself a cup of coffee. The quiet hum of the world waking up felt sacred, like the earth itself was holding its breath in reverence. She glanced out the window at the small garden she had started months ago. The flowers were in full bloom, a riot of color swaying gently in the morning breeze. Selah sat at the kitchen table, her journal open before her, pen poised above the paper. For a moment she simply stared at the blank page, her heart brimming with gratitude. Slowly, she began to write. God, thank you for every moment, every lesson, every person you've placed in my path. I don't know where this journey will lead next, but I know one thing. I will follow you. The words felt final, like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. Later that afternoon, Selah walked through the doors of the community center one last time. It was buzzing with activity. Volunteers organizing supplies, families laughing in the dining area, children playing in the courtyard. The air was alive with energy and hope. Mrs. Jenkins was sitting near the entrance, her cane propped beside her chair. She smiled as Selah approached. "Well, there's our girl," Mrs. Jenkins said softly. "You know, Selah, there was a time I thought this place would fall apart. But then you walked through those doors, and everything changed." Selah knelt beside her, taking her frail hand in her own. "Mrs. Jenkins, this place was always strong. The people here, they're the ones who made it that way. I just answered the call." Tears glistened in the elderly woman's eyes. "That's all any of us can do, dear. Answer the call." That evening, Selah stood at the edge of the lake where her journey had first begun. The water was still, reflecting the fading hues of the sunset in perfect clarity. She closed her eyes and let the quiet wrap around her like a warm blanket. So much had changed. She had changed. The scared, uncertain woman who once sat on this same bench felt like a distant memory. But Selah knew the transformation wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about finally seeing who she had been all along. The wind whispered softly across the surface of the lake, carrying with it a familiar voice in her heart. "You are chosen. You are ready. Walk boldly in my light." Selah opened her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered back, "I will." The following Sunday, Selah stood at the back of a small church she had been invited to visit. The congregation was singing, their voices blending together in a harmony that made the air itself feel alive. Selah closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. When the pastor finished his sermon, he invited Selah to share a few words. She stepped up to the podium, her heart steady, her voice clear. Faith isn't a destination, it's a journey filled with moments of clarity and moments of doubt, moments of strength and moments of weakness. But through it all, God walks with us. Every tear, every triumph, every quiet whisper in the stillness, it's all part of his plan. The congregation was silent, every eye locked on Selah. "I've learned that walking in God's light isn't about having all the answers. It's about taking the next step, even when the path ahead is unclear. It's about trusting that the light He's placed within us is enough to guide the way. As she stepped away from the podium, Sarah felt something shift deep inside her, a sense of peace so profound it was almost tangible. That night, back in her small home, Sarah sat by her window with her journal open once again. The stars outside twinkled softly, scattered across the vast sky like tiny lanterns. She wrote, "God's light isn't something we earn, it's something we carry. It's in the way we speak, the way we listen, the way we show up for others. It's in every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every quiet prayer whispered in the dark." Walking in His light doesn't mean the path will always be easy, but it does mean we'll never walk it alone. She set her pen down, closed her journal, and gazed out at the night sky. Months passed, and Sarah's journey continued. She spoke in more rooms filled with faces eager to hear her story. She met more people, each one leaving an imprint on her heart. But through it all, one thing remained constant: her quiet, unwavering trust in God. One afternoon, while volunteering at a local shelter, a young woman approached Sarah. She looked hesitant, clutching a small notebook to her chest. "Miss Sarah," the girl said softly, I wanted to thank you. Your words, your story, it gave me hope. It reminded me that I'm not alone." Sarah's heart swelled as she smiled warmly. "You're never alone, sweetheart, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The young woman nodded, tears shining in her eyes as she walked away. That evening, Sarah stood on her porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and violet. The air was still, heavy with the sacred quiet of twilight. Her journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be more mountains to climb, more storms to weather, and more moments of doubt. But Sarah knew, deep down in her soul, that she was walking exactly where she was meant to be. She closed her eyes, her lips forming a soft, whispered prayer. "Thank you, God, for every step, every breath, every moment. Let me keep walking in your light." The wind stirred softly around her, as if carrying her prayer into the heavens. And there, under the vast expanse of a sky scattered with stars, Sarah stood, steady, strong, and bathed in the unshakable light of God.